Hello, hello. I know there's still people waiting for food, but for the sake of time, we are going to get started. It's not on? How is this now? Thank you. Good evening and welcome to tonight's event, The Ceaseless Fight for a More Decent World. My name is Azmat Khan, and I'm the director of the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism, which helps inform and shape how we practice journalism with a global lens. Tonight's event is co-sponsored with the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University and the Human Rights Institute at Columbia Law School. I'll introduce our first speaker in just a moment, but I did want to mention that in the back there are books for sale, and Kenneth Roth will be signing them later on, so don't forget to purchase your copy. I'd like to introduce the director of the Human Rights Institute, who will frame tonight's event and introduce our speakers. Sarah Knuckey is a human rights advocate and a clinical professor of law, and she directs the Human Rights Clinic and the Human Rights Institute. Knuckey and Human Rights Clinic students work in partnership with social justice advocates, communities, and rights holders around the world to investigate human rights abuses and advocate for justice and accountability. The clinic prepares students for lifelong careers in social justice advocacy and works to promote human rights and recalibrate the global power imbalances that drive economic and political inequality, exploitation, threats to physical security, poverty, and environmental injustice. There are many more things I could tell you about her and about her students, but I've had a chance to meet them on a few occasions, and I've been so impressed by the work that they do. I'm particularly pleased that tonight brings together an intersection of journalists, of those working in the human rights space, in a conversation that will be incredibly timely. So please welcome Sarah Knuckey to frame tonight's event.
Thanks, Azmat. Azmat's always a regular guest in the law school, and she's frequently the favorite guest lecturer. Some of the most important questions that are being asked right now are how to protect human rights, social justice, in the face of democratic backsliding, authoritarianism, the climate crisis, and economic inequality. For all of us grappling with these questions, Ken Roth's new book, Righting Wrongs, is really an essential read. His new book is part memoir, and some of the most touching elements of the book is where he's sharing his family history and what inspired him to become an activist. It's part history of a sector of the human rights movement, and it's part a strategy guide. Ken begins the book by saying, I think it's important to start by saying that even in the most dire situations, it's possible to make a difference. He then goes on to detail how Human Rights Watch worked alongside activists and movements all around the world to impact human rights on the ground. As much as the book examines horrific abuses from every corner of the globe, one thing that really stands out in the book is its accounts of the strength, resilience, and creativity of brilliant human rights defenders in countries all around the world, from Syrian doctors to Polish dissidents and Palestinian and Rwandan human rights activists. The human rights ecosystem involves thousands of actors with many different theories of change and approaches, from strategic impact litigation to grassroots movement organizing. This book is very important in showing how some of the many tools in the human rights toolbox can work. It's full of case studies, very detailed case studies looking at the United States, Syria, DR Congo, and shows how public advocacy and much behind-the-scene work of activists can make change. Ken examines under what conditions Human Rights Watch's strategies of fact-finding, pressuring governments through advocacy strategies like name and shame work, and also when they don't work. The book raises many important questions about the contemporary human rights movement. Have rights been too inflated? What is the role of global north INGOs in a large, complex ecosystem? What are the limits of name and shame strategies for making real change? Are boomerang strategies working in a multipolar world? The very last chapter of the book begins the contest between Autocracy and democracy is now at the forefront of the modern human rights struggle. What can human rights offer us in the face of such threats to democracy and rights in many countries around the world? To discuss these questions, we're thrilled to welcome to the stage Ken Roth, who was the director of Human Rights Watch for 3 decades. In the early stages of his career, he was a prosecutor, a theme that comes up throughout his book, Righting Wrongs. He did volunteer work in human rights before becoming the deputy director. As the executive director, he led Human Rights Watch's incredible growth in finances, in staff, and in global reach and impact. He also oversaw expansions in the issues that were covered at Human Rights Watch into more socioeconomic rights issues and the environment and climate change. Joining Ken to discuss the book is Professor Sheila Coronel. Sheila is the director of the Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism here at the Columbia Journalism School. She has extensive experience as an investigative reporter, particularly in the Philippines, investigating human rights abuses. She founded the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. Please join me in welcoming Ken Roth and Sheila Coronel to the stage.
Hi, Ken.
There we go. Hello.
Hi, Ken.
Good to be here.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome, Ken, to Fortress Columbia. It's
to get in. That's right.
It's nice to be here with you and to
There's
have
my QR code.
exactly. So let's cut to the chase. Sarah gave such a wonderful summary of your book, but this is what your book is largely about. It's many things, but a lot of it describes vividly through multiple case studies this repertoire of tactics that Human Rights Watch and the international human rights movement has evolved over time, naming and shaming, putting pressure on governments, fact-finding. I'd like to ask whether, the evolution of this repertoire of tactics was really because it was a product of its time. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism and of dictatorships in the global south, it was a propitious time for human rights campaigning, maybe different from the current moment that we are in.
That's a very good question. What I do, the reason I wrote the book is that, when you talk to people about, I work to defend human rights, the classic response is, isn't that nice? And it's, there's this assumption that, you're like, some well-intentioned, ineffectual activist, who stands around picketing or, whatever. And it makes no difference. And what I wanted to show is that the defense of human rights is a process of playing hardball. And that our job is to change the cost-benefit calculation of repression. That we assume governments have their reasons to violate rights. And our job is to make that less beneficial to them. And so that's where we get into the tactics that you describe. And it does always begin with a careful investigation, documentation, reporting of the abuses in question. And one step, one option, one tool is the process of shaming. I stress one because I'll get into the rest in a moment. But the shaming does often work because in today's world, every government has to at least pretend that it respects human rights. That has become a basic element of one's legitimacy. If you don't respect human rights, that means you're not looking out for your people, you're just looking out for yourself. And nobody wants to be known for that. And so when we can spotlight the discrepancy between pretense and practice, it's embarrassing, it's shameful, it's delegitimizing. And governments, hate it. They all hate it. And they'll try various cheap techniques, PR techniques to get rid of us. But in the end, they learn that they're not going to get rid of the bad press without changing the bad conduct. And so that's a big part of what we do. But it's not the only thing, because there are certain cases where shaming isn't going to work. I mean, I opened the book describing Idlib in northwestern Syria, where Assad, the Syrian president, was largely beyond shaming. And so in a situation like that, you've got to figure out, well, what are the other points of pressure? And Human Rights Watch, in addition to having its research staff and the staff that publicizes the work, has a so-called advocacy staff. And their job is, they're based in different capitals around the world. And they go to influential governments and they say, would you use your clout on our behalf? And here the premise is every government wants something from the international community. They want, military sales. They want, some kind of beneficial aid package or certain trade benefits. And a lot of times, all they really want is to be invited to a summit and get photographed with respected leaders, and they can pretend to the folks back home that they're respected too. So the point is to figure out, okay, what do they care about, and how do we deprive them of that until they change? And so this advocacy work with influential governments is a big part of what we do. And a lot of the stories in the book are about how we, gradually got governments that may be reluctant. So you may have to use shaming to get, the French to do the right thing or the Germans to do the right thing. But, get them ultimately to use their clout on our behalf. And then obviously in extreme cases, we try to get people prosecuted. And nobody wants to be charged. Nobody wants to face prison. So the, figuring out what's the right combination, what might work, is, a question of strategy and creativity and perseverance. And I try to just run through a bunch of examples in the book to give a sense of that. Sometimes are more propitious than others, as you note. And, some of the techniques work better with a certain kind of government than with others. But one thing I've learned is that there's always an angle. Regardless of how awful the government is, there's always something you can do. And if you can figure that out, you can generate pressure and push them in the right direction.
So from going around the room, I know that a lot of people here feel very dark at this moment, that this is a dark moment. And I guess the next obvious question is not so much whether naming and shaming and these tactics work, but will they work as effectively now as they did before, given the rise of autocracies, democratic, backsliding, the seeming shamelessness, imperviousness to shame and pressure of many governments, including this one, and also kind of vibe shift in the global community, tending more towards conservatism, rule of, law and order, rather than respect for rights.
Okay, Michelle, there's a lot in that question, and let me unpack it a bit. First, in this, there's a tendency these days to say, oh, the autocrats are winning. And I'm very explicit in the book. I think that that's a mistake. I actually think that if you put yourself in the shoes of an autocrat, it's a pretty hostile world out there. And I say that for several reasons. One is that, autocrats claim that they deliver better than democracies because democracies are messy and divisive and slower. But autocrats also, surround themselves by sycophants. They don't allow free debate. They don't allow free information. And they tend to make bad decisions. That's how Putin invaded Ukraine. That's how Xi Jinping is undermining the Chinese economy because he's prioritizing his power over what's needed to move things forward. And so, if you look at the big autocrats, they're actually not doing that well. Then you look around the world, and what's interesting to me is that the people who live under autocracies are pretty clear that that's not what they want. And we've seen, over the last few years, in just country after country after country, people taking to the streets, often at risk of being, detained or shot in a place like Iran, making clear that they want democracy, they want accountable government. And sometimes it works. Recently Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. A lot of times it doesn't because autocrats can be ruthless. But it's quite clear what the people want, which is part of why I say that this is a hostile environment. The irony here is that in the established democracies, there are people who are ripe for the autocratic appeal. And these are the classic left behinds who feel that they're economically stagnating, they're facing growing inequality, they are not heard by the government, they feel the government's distant experts, they feel disrespected. And these are the people who are willing to try something else, willing to try a Trump, that upends the system. Now, there, in that situation, there is still a role for the classic tools. I spend quite a bit of time talking about how we've addressed the autocracy that still is in Hungary and was until recently in Poland with the Law and Justice Party. And the key there, obviously these autocrats, they had their base that liked the, anti-immigrant, anti-gay, anti-liberated women. That kind of, very anti-rights platform worked for their base, but it didn't work in Brussels. And they were very dependent on big European Union subsidies, which we were able to get conditioned on changes in the rights practices. And it contributed to the electoral defeat of the Law and Justice Party in Poland. Orban has, had to back off various things. He's still obviously in power. So, that was the angle there. When I look at Trump, who is, if you say, Donald, you're violating human rights, he'll laugh at you. So, that's not going to do any good. But you've got to figure out, okay, what does this guy care about? And I think shaming does still have a role with Trump because, Trump has a fragile ego. He's actually quite insecure. And he really cares about being seen as a master deal maker. And I think the way to get progress with Trump in places like Gaza or Ukraine is to point out that if he follows his sort of anti-rights instincts, he's going to get bad deals. He's going to leave a bad legacy. So, this whole ridiculous thing we just saw on Friday with Zelensky, what that was really about is, not, where do you move the territorial divide in eastern Ukraine? It was about, are you going to have just a ceasefire that allows Putin to rearm and reinvade and proceed with what he really cares about, which is snuffing out Ukraine's democracy? Or is there going to be a security guarantee, European peacekeepers on the ground with some kind of American backstop? And if Trump doesn't give that in the end, the Ukraine deal is going to look awful. In the end, Ukraine's democracy is going to be jeopardized, and Trump is going to be known as the Neville Chamberlain of the 21st century. That's not what he wants, and that gives us some leverage, I think.
Are you sure that's not what he wants? That isn't Trump part of, wants to reorder the world so that the autocrats of the world sort of unite around a new world order, not the old one that has prevailed since the end of the Second World War?
I think you're right. That he obviously admires autocrats like Putin, I think for various reasons. One is that they can get things done without a pesky opposition. He wishes he could do that, no checks and balances. They are long-serving, so they're not sort of, fly-by-night European prime ministers.
Also kleptocracies.
Yes, which, he recognizes very well.
Yeah.
And, so there is a side of him that just says, oh, this should be a great power sphere of influence divided up. But that's also not really the world he lives in. And I think in the end, if he were to just say, oh, Ukraine is in the Russian sphere of influence, we're going to let him have it, he would be lambasted. And I that's not what he wants. So even though I think you're right, he has some of these instincts, he is very reputationally sensitive. And the audience he cares about are still Americans. And most Americans are still very skeptical of Putin and don't want to hand him Ukraine.
You mentioned Putin. What about Putin? What are the pressure points on him? Putin clearly, like Trump, does not care about human rights. He cares about rebuilding, an imperial Russia. Given all of that, what are the possibilities of making deals with somebody like him?
Yeah. In the book, I spend a lot of time about how we successfully pushed Putin to stop bombing civilians in Syria's Idlib province. But this was pre-Ukraine. This was when he still had a reputation he cared about, and so we were able to enlist Merkel, Macron, and Erdogan to twist Putin's arm, and he acquiesced, and we basically stopped the bombing. So that was a big success. It's different now post-Ukraine because now he looks more like Assad did back then, with not much of a reputation, and everything has been thrown at him. Because sanctions, arming the opposition. There's not a whole lot left. I think, though, I don't think Putin is as home free as one sometimes portrays him, in that, his economy is very precarious. He's churning through young men and military materiel, this is not sustainable for Putin. And I think he recognizes, maybe he's got a year left of this, maybe a little bit longer. But if the West, continues to provide the basics for Ukraine, and particularly with this evolution of drone warfare where Ukraine actually can hold its own, what he's doing now is not going to last. He kind of needs a deal. But he needs a face-saving deal. If it looks like a loss, then he could be overthrown.
So do you think it's actually good that Trump is, in this kind of bromance with Putin, that a deal can be made that's advantageous to Ukraine?
I mean, I have no trouble with trying to make a deal. The idea of just, slugging it out with endless loss of life among soldiers was getting hard to tolerate. And this is one weakness of humanitarian law, because while early on, Mariupol was being bombed and Bucha was having executions and all, today it's mostly on the front lines. It's mostly soldiers. These are not war crimes. These are just, people being treated as cannon fodder. And I think it's, appropriate that Trump says, kind of, what's the point? You're killing 1,000 people a week for, a little marginal gain of territory. So his instinct, let's cut a deal, is a good one. If he, for tactical reasons, is buttering up Putin a little bit to get a deal, fine. If the deal, though, is capitulating to Putin, not fine. And that's the big open question with Trump, and we don't really know where his head is, and I'm not sure he knows where his head is. I mean, that's one thing you see about Trump, is that the guy is fickle. And, it was horrible on Friday to think these, momentous decisions of U.S. foreign policy are being made because J.D. Vance, was trying to get noticed behind, Elon Musk and didn't know how to answer Zelensky's points about why Putin can't be trusted just to promise something. You need guarantees. And when that, in embarrassment, he then resorted to, you didn't say you were thankful, Right. And this, this sets off Trump. I mean, it's embarrassing that this is how policy is made. But it also shows that nothing is written in stone. These guys don't really stand for much right now. They're still figuring it out, and they can be pushed.
Yeah. I mean, it makes for great television, as Trump said.
As he said, yes, yes.
So where does China...
By the way, it was like, why was this all being televised? This was not serious. You don't have this incredibly important summit on TV. You have, a 5-minute quick questions, and then you go behind closed doors and work it out. So this was not serious from the start.
Well, where does China fit into all of these? Because you said China is the greatest threat to human rights. Do you still think so, given what's happening in Russia and Russia's increasing aggressiveness?
I do. And I say this not simply because the level of Chinese repression is severe, which it is. And if you look at what China's been doing to the Uyghurs, to detain 1 million Uyghurs out of a population of 11 million, basically to force them to abandon their religion, their culture, their language. I mean, this is horrible. It certainly is a crime against humanity. Some have said it's a genocide because of the remarkable drop in the birth rate. But the reason I said that I see China as the greatest threat is that no one else devotes anywhere near the resources of China to trying to globalize their censorship and really penalize anybody, any place, who says something bad about them, about their human rights record. And then, audaciously, no one else is trying to rewrite human rights standards. So, Putin violates human rights standards, humanitarian law. Other governments do that as well. China is literally taking these very detailed treaties that provide all these duties and responsibilities to governments and essentially ripping them up and dumbing them down and saying all that really matters are 3 things. Is GDP per capita growing? Are we providing stability? And are people happy? So that's what they say when you read their speeches. Now, happiness in a country where nobody can possibly poll honestly is a meaningless concept. Stability, security, this is just, repression, so that doesn't really get you a whole lot. What it really comes down to is the economy growing. And Xi Jinping says, if the economy is growing, then I'm respecting human rights. Now, to understand how radical that is, we're not surprised that Xi Jinping would object to civil and political rights because, there's no election, there's no free press, no civil society. But he objects to economic and social rights as well. back in the Soviet days, people would say, oh, well, they promote economic and social rights. In the West, they promote civil and political rights. Xi Jinping doesn't want any of that, because economic and social rights ask, are you taking available resources and devoting it to improving the lot of the worst off segments of society? And that requires these awkward questions about, well, what's happening with the Uyghurs? What's happening with the Tibetans? What's happening with the rural Han Chinese who are stuck in the hukou system and are totally segregated? And that's why he wants this simplistic definition, which has no role for the individual. It is utterly antithetical to rights. And then to make matters worse, in Geneva, when his vision of the UN Human Rights Council is no investigation, no reporting, no condemnation. All you're supposed to do is sit around and have nice, pleasant conversations about how each government is finding its own path to realize human rights. So he just wants to completely destroy the human rights system. And that's why I see him as most dangerous.
But Ken, doesn't he make a compelling argument? I mean, to many in the global south, his argument that economic development takes precedence over political freedoms, that what matters really is economic security and a better life for people, and China is an example of that, raising standards of living in the course of 1 or 2 generations, that these matter more than the rights of the individual. And China has succeeded in convincing many Chinese that it's part of a social contract that benefits them, that this is the price they have to pay for the lifestyle that they are living.
Yeah, I mean, that is the autocrat's argument. But if you start examining it a little bit, first, I mean, yes, China has advanced without civil and political rights. It still has not gotten out of the middle income trap. And compare it to Hong Kong or Taiwan, the other parts of China, which are developed economies now, completely middle class, if not upper middle class, and they've done it with civil and political rights. So the idea that you need repression to have economic advancement is disproved just by looking at the different parts of China. But also, I have this section in the book where, do you all know John Rawls, the philosopher, and he has this veil of ignorance. And so I take a version of the veil of ignorance and say, imagine yourself, you're going to come back and you can choose, are you going to live under an autocrat or are you going to live under an accountable government? And you would have to be out of your mind to choose an autocrat, because while every once in a while you get an enlightened despot like Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, the vast majority of autocrats are self-serving, they are corrupt, they undermine the economy. And so you get, Mugabe or Maduro, or you can just go
Trump.
Or Trump, yeah, who's already, he's not going to do well with the economy.
The majority of Americans made that choice, Ken, a democratic choice, that they wanted a strong ruler who may trample on rights but promises them, sort of golden age, make America great again.
Yeah. Well, look, I think what happened in America, which is not that different from why the AfD is doing well in Germany, or why Marine Le Pen is doing well in France, or why Geert Wilders did well in the Netherlands, is as I said at the outset, there are people who feel left behind. I think most importantly, really disrespected by an elite, kind of expert-oriented government. And I think a lot of the votes for Trump were just anti-system votes. And yes, he was promising, to stop inflation and reduce the cost of housing and reduce the cost of eggs. It's so far it's working on the opposite direction. I mean, the tariffs are all going to be completely antithetical to that. So I don't know that we can say that people made a real economic bet here, because it's not going to pay off. But they did like his anti-establishment voice, which speaks to, I think, the failure, an important failure of American democracy, which needs to be remedied. And, one thing I get into in the book, it's not simply a matter of democracies really needing to, really listen to everybody, not just serve the urban elites. But it also, one way to counter the autocrats' demonization of minorities, and this is kind of a classic tool, is you just pick some disfavored minority, bash them, take away their rights, and just kind of define them outside the community of rights, a threat to the community. The counter to that is to build a strong sense of nation, a sense where everybody on a certain territory is part of your community and deserves rights. And I, in this respect, I'm critical of progressives because I think that, our identity politics has not served well the effort to build a national community. It considers us as sort of a collection of interests rather than a single nation. And I think that makes it easier for the autocrats to then carve out certain interests. So I think we all have work to do. And that's, I think, part of why the Democratic Party is just struggling right now. We've got to figure out, how do you deliver better for the people who feel left behind, and how do you counter this demonization of certain disfavored minorities?
Yeah, ultimately, human rights advocacy depends on faith and certain optimism, in people, in their capacity to discern the truth and to appreciate facts and evidence, in their capacity for empathy. And we see all of this eroding at this current moment. We have we are in a journalism school, so I should ask this question. We live in an information space where things are seeming to be turned on their heads. You have extreme right-wing groups saying they are for free speech when they are in fact suppressing speech. The January 6th insurrectionists are seen as political detainees there because of their... So how can human rights advocacy prevail at this moment when there is, you put a premium on facts and fact-finding and evidence, when it's memes rather than facts that rule, and where societies are so polarized that it's very difficult to get a consensus on what is right and what is wrong, and who is being wronged and who's doing the wrongdoing.
These are the big questions. And let me respond in two ways. First, I actually don't accept that we're in a post-fact society. Yes, memes, can be powerful, but I do still think most people, or at least a critical mass of people, let me put it that way, do seek out the truth. And you can find the truth. There is something to be said for respected institutions. And so, when I'm on social media, I can see the garbage, but I also know, when something is coming from a journalist or a media entity or a source that I know is generally reliable. And I discern in that way. And I don't think I'm different from most other discerning readers. So I think facts still matter. And indeed, if they didn't, you wouldn't find these governments going to such lengths to censor. They would just be resorting to propaganda. But it's a dual thing for governments. They really want to censor too. They don't want access to the truth. The other issue that you get at is just the media landscape is so transformed, and it's no longer listening to Walter Cronkite. We all know that. But it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, people around the world have access to social media and can get word out in a way that was never possible before. So the idea of horrible atrocities taking place in obscurity, I don't think we live in that world anymore. We would find out very quickly. It is a mobilizing tool. It is a way that ordinary people can try to hold their governments accountable, but the bad guys can use it too. And it's a battle. I still think it's a net positive. I think social media has been overall a democratizing instrument. But as I mentioned with much in the book, you can't look at the defense of human rights as a linear process. And I actually open up with the Martin Luther King Jr. quote of the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And that's not true. And in fact, he says it's not true later in the speech, but nobody ever quotes the rest of the speech, and it's an incessant battle. And sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. As I say, governments are always going to be pushing against us, but there are enough times when we win, enough times when the pressure does change the cost-benefit analysis, that it's a battle worth engaging in. And that's why, and I'm hoping the book is a mobilizing instrument, because I do think that all of us have a role to play here, and particularly in this information environment where people are much more likely to be influenced by their friends and family than by some distant institution. And so insofar as the defense of human rights depends on reflecting governmental misconduct against public morality, we all help build public morality by speaking out, by speaking with our friends. And that's one message I hope to get across, and that it is a responsibility that all of us have to exercise and speak about our political judgments.
It's not a fair fight, though, is it? I mean, the platforms are ruled by all these tech billionaires who have their own ideological reasons for drowning us in a deluge of disinformation. I think the challenge is not so much the ability to get facts, but to make sure we are heard. Human rights advocates, journalists, people who believe in facts and evidence are heard and seen above the din of all this social media toxicity.
Yeah, but I mean, look at if you had a choice between being Elon Musk with his followers versus owning the New York Times and having that as a voice, the New York Times is more powerful.
I would choose to be Elon Musk.
Really?
I think.
Well, yeah, if he got his bank account, maybe. But no, I mean, I think that I say this really because I think the New York Times and the more traditional liberal media is still incredibly powerful.
As of today, yes. I mean, does everyone agree here? Is the New York Times still incredibly powerful? Can you raise your hand? They don't agree with you, I think.
Well.
Is social media more powerful than mainstream media? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, as a regular user of social media, I just see the power of, and it's not any single article, but it's the repetition and the scrutiny and just the deluge of reporting of misconduct that really shapes public.
Well, it's true. I mean, you look at the example of Gaza and how all of these citizen journalists in Gaza have been able to bring the truth out to the world when journalists were not allowed into Gaza.
No, I mean, there was Al Jazeera, but
Yeah.
I mean, Al Jazeera was brilliant in terms of just exposing all of this,
Right. So, Ken, are you optimistic about the future? I mean, it's an optimistic book for all the challenges that you've lined up. There's also enough success in your 30 years in Human Rights Watch to, I think, fuel your optimism. But looking all around you today, do you think there's enough there to be optimistic about the future of human rights advocacy?
I mean, look, part of my answer to you, Sheila, is just temperamental. I mean, I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't, kind of always find some reason I think we can make it better. But I've also, this is a bad time. I recognize that. But we've lived through bad times before. I mean, think about what happened after 9/11, where, not only was the U.S., utterly unreliable in defending human rights, it was big time violating them with, massive torture centers and throwing people in prison, endlessly without trial. I mean, it was, and this was a global effort, in the name of fighting terrorism. So that was, a bleak time. And within, 3 years or so, we had turned that around. So it's, and I mean, this is, I think Trump is going to overreach. I think there's going to be a backlash. So this is, this is a bad time, but I think we need to keep pushing on him, keep pointing out, his hypocrisy, the idiocies that sometimes, are making policy. And, this is, remember, this is his high point. He just came in office. I think he's going to run into trouble. And our job is to make that arrive more quickly than otherwise.
We just have to wait, as James
Not
Carville
just wait.
says.
No, I know. And I think Carville is wrong. The idea of just sitting back and waiting for them to blow it themselves is a mistake. I think we got to help them blow it, and we can.
I think the difference is that, there was, and there still is, a rules-based international order where there was a consensus that these are the rules. I don't know whether that consensus still exists, whether the rules and norms that have governed international relations, the way nations behave in the world, whether that consensus still exists.
Well, I mean, first of all, it depends what rules. Rules-based order is a big name. But, can you invade another country?
Yeah.
I mean, the UN General Assembly yet again denounced Russia's invasion. Obviously, Paul Kagame is doing that in Eastern DRC right now, but getting a lot of pushback for that. Not getting the same sanctions as he did last time, but getting widespread condemnation. So I think that is still a line that people don't want crossed. When it comes to, human rights standards, I mean, at a basic level, the idea that these norms are no longer there, it's crazy. I mean, I've never met somebody who wants to be summarily executed. you know, or somebody who wants to be tortured, or somebody who wants to be deprived of housing or healthcare or education. You know, so I mean, these are basic rights everybody wants for themselves. Now, some people don't want them for the other guy, you know, and that's a problem of building community, of building a, you know, recognition that a kind of a Kantian view of the world, you know, how other people are treated is going to affect how you're treated, is the work we have set out for us. But I think these standards are still very powerful.
I'd like to have them ask questions, because I think, can you please line up behind the microphone and just introduce yourself? And yes, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi.
There's a switch at the back. You just put it.
I don't see the switch, but I can speak loud. My name is Nisha, and for the background, I'm originally from Iran. I did lots of activism in Iran and outside. Considering, and also for 19 years, I worked for United Nations, especially with refugees overseas, and then in Canada. And then Afghanistan evacuation happened, and I was here, and I moved to DC to help as much as I can. I'm sure you're going to tell me I'm wrong, but I would be grateful if you explain for me why I'm wrong. This all 43 years, 19 years of professional working, my understanding is that there is no human rights. Even there was no human rights in the mind and ideas of people who order these human rights institutions and conventions. That it was just an idea that, oh, you know, we are past Second World War, there are some people are talking about human rights, let's just give them something so that we could keep them quiet, and then we can continue doing what we have been doing, but just not this time to ourselves, and make sure that we are going to be united as the Western countries and do it to others. 9/11, you said that we turned it out in 3 years, but I don't see that. I see that for 20 years, NATO and US Army was in Afghanistan with no result, and most casualty of human beings that we even don't know the numbers because they stopped counting at some point.
I think your question is about the reality. It does not conform to what the human rights standards and ideals that
Yeah,
we
I mean,
have. Yeah.
when we say, you know, there are no human rights, I mean, take Iran. I mean, the women protesting in the streets, they thought their rights. You know, they certainly knew what they wanted. The government didn't want to give it to them. But, you know, this idea of human rights are very, I think, you know, just kind of central to people's sense of identity of who they are. So I think at that level, there absolutely are rights. These just reflect what it is to be human. If you mean, do governments respect rights? Lots of times they don't. And the US is often one of the biggest hypocrites around, where, you know, sometimes they promote rights, but other times they violate them big time. So that's, you know, our challenge is to push them to be more consistent.
Give one example that they promote real human rights internationally, not inside, not for
You mean the United States?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
or any Western
Yeah.
country.
Well, I mean, look, I
They
just,
advocate
yeah.
for
No, I mean, one of the examples I give in the book is a decade ago, Rwanda invaded Eastern Congo using the M23 rebel group. And Human Rights Watch at that stage, we still do have an office in Eastern Congo in Goma, and documented how the Rwandan military was backing the M23. And Paul Kagame, the Rwandan president, said, no, we're not, and just lied, you know? And so we did a second report, and he lied again, and a third report, and he lied again. But ultimately, everybody believed us and not Kagame, and started pressuring Kagame. And ultimately, what really made the difference is we got US Secretary of State John Kerry and British Foreign Secretary William Hague to call Kagame and say, you stop or your aid is cut off. And the M23 dissolved within days. It was gone. And for 8 years or so, the people of Eastern Congo didn't have this predatory force there. So that was, you know, the US and Western governments making a big difference. Now today the M23 is back, and everybody's, you know, protesting, but they're not doing the same thing. They're not conditioning aid for various reasons. Kagame spent the 8 years trying to make himself indispensable. You know, he's got his peacekeepers in Mozambique. He was ready to take British asylum seekers. You know, he sponsors Arsenal. He has a conference center. You know, he's doing all these things, and for various reasons, governments are not insisting. But it shows that the West can make a difference, and sometimes does, and now is taking half steps which have been insufficient. But I can give a lot of examples where Western support has made a difference. I talk about how, working with the Netherlands, we got the UN Human Rights Council to scrutinize the Saudi-led coalition's bombing of Yemeni civilians. And during the 4 years that existed, it made a huge difference. When it was finally lifted, the civilian casualties doubled. So it made a very concrete life and death difference. And there are tons of examples like that. So, to say the West never makes a difference, it's just not true. To say it's inconsistent, it's hypocritical, that's true. And we have to make it better.
Thank you so much for speaking to us today. You mentioned the various levers and pressure points on governments. What, to your mind, are the levers on American big tech companies like Meta and X, especially under Trump? Meta has been pilloried for its failures on hate speech. Shaming seems to have failed as Zuckerberg veers sharply to the right. And legislation to regulate seems increasingly unlikely. So what levers can get Zuck and Musk to course correct in favor of human rights?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say something here, which I'm not even sure I 100% agree. It's sort of a thought, and Jamil will probably hate me for saying this. But, one of the big questions is, are the social media platforms like a newspaper or like the telephone company? That is to say, are they responsible for what shows up, or are they just, a technical vehicle for other people to say things? And so far, we treat them like the telephone company, and they have, little if any liability for what shows up. But we know that their algorithms determine what shows up in your feed. And it's not quite the same as the New York Times. They're not writing it, but they're still pretty much figuring out what you see. And it's not clear to me that we should be treating them as the phone company. And if we didn't, if we found some intermediary step, that would immediately put pressure on them for much more reasonable content moderation. So this is an idea I really haven't thought of. This is not my area of expertise, but I do think we have to rethink some of these things.
Thank you.
That was Meghnad Bose from the Columbia Journalism Review. Your name, please.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for the discussion. I want to ask, how do you ensure that you are staying neutral or really independent from government influence? And also, how do you ensure that you are not, obviously human rights are very basic. I think everyone can agree to the basic human rights around the world, but how do we ensure that we are not approaching it from a very Western perspective, right? Like, for example, talking about China, it's, there are also differences in culture, why some cultures are more individualistic, some cultures are more about the kind of like common society, etc., and that is more important for them. How, for example, would you ensure, that we are approaching that we are pressuring different governments, no matter how much we are maybe aligned with them from our own nationality, background, etc., in the same kind of ways? And as an example, talking about Israel and Palestine, how do you, for example, ensure that you put pressure on the American and US government or European governments to put pressure on Israel or not continue supporting Israel, who are committing human rights violations, right? Like these kind of things.
Okay. Well, in terms of, first of all, just to financial answer your question, Human Rights Watch, like Amnesty, takes no government money. So, the fact that USAID is basically killing a lot of the human rights movement doesn't, affect the institutions of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, even though it affects many of our partners. So that's very much by design. We don't want to be influenced by governments. In terms of any particular country, you've got to train researchers and create a culture of objectivity. And this was part of my job, but it's also just something that I shared with the leadership of Human Rights Watch, where we just makes absolutely clear that you don't pursue a partisan agenda. You do the fact-finding and you call it as it is, regardless of the advocacy consequences, regardless of what you think is the right thing. Just what happened, that's what we want to know. And then once we have that, then we become advocates. Then we start pushing, And it's an odd kind of bifurcated methodology, which is not maybe natural, but it becomes, I think, instinctive to people who work at Human Rights Watch and similar human rights organizations. And that the fact-finding is as subjective as you can make it, and then you want the advocacy to be as creative and persistent, as tough as it can be. But they're separate, ventures. in terms of, how do we, nobody would say you're not being tough enough on the US or European governments with respect to Israel. That's not our problem. But it is, but in a situation like Israel-Palestine, where everything you do is scrutinized, we do a few things. One is, as in any conflict situation, we look at all sides. So Human Rights Watch obviously reports on Israelis, but reports on Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah. And so that's a basic principle. The standards applied are the same, applied every place else, international humanitarian law. The fact-finding is the same. And we know we're going to be scrutinized, actually more than any other country. So we are 100% sure that what comes out is accurate. And I think for me, the clearest example is when we came out with our report finding apartheid, which we knew was going to be,
Apartheid in Palestine.
That Israel was committing the crime of apartheid in the occupied territory. And we knew that that was going to be explosive and scrutinized. And when we put it out, the Israeli government didn't know what to do with it. It was a 200-plus page report. It was factually accurate. It was legally sound. And so its supporters resorted to the usual name-calling. We're biased, we're anti-Semitic, whatever. We took that as a victory. They didn't know what to say. And that report and then similar reports by our colleague organizations have really changed the paradigm so that today the Israeli government's preferred option, which is a forever occupation, just perennially kick the can down the road, pretend there's no partner in peace, is no longer acceptable because that's seen as apartheid. And so, but it is a matter of just building a culture within an institution. Everything is reviewed very carefully by a range of people within the organization, and then trusting the people we hired, train them and then trust them to follow those principles. But we've I think been very successful in doing that, and have not had problems where people have been able to show bias.
I think it's also you have a diverse staff and people in very different parts of the world, so that you're not just getting a New York point of view.
Absolutely. We have, I think, 80-some nationalities on staff based all over the world. So, and that's a huge strength because for most countries, you've got, a national of the country or somebody, at least from the region, who is intimately involved in the research.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Dante. I'm a journalism student here. My question is around human rights inflation that you sort of talked about earlier. Some of my first classes and courses where I studied human rights, we talked about human rights being elastic and expansive. And then you mentioned this concept I wasn't familiar with about their inflation. So could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Where it comes up in the book, Mike Pompeo, who was Trump's last Secretary of State, created this thing called the Commission on Unalienable Rights. And his point was that we've moved too far from the original rights. And he felt, all that we should really care about is, religious freedom, and that we shouldn't care about reproductive freedom, and certainly not LGBT rights, And so he was, picking and choosing. And we were very critical of this. And he was, he was taking the basic treaties and just, removing sections of them. And so that was, we disfavored that. But where I thought he had a bit of a point is that, if everything becomes a right, that pulls everything out of democratic political deliberation. Because the effect of a right is to say, this is something that a government has to do. It's not something that's left to the political process. And, just to give a contemporary example of this, there is a movement to say, well, shouldn't people fleeing climate change be refugees? Or shouldn't people fleeing poverty be refugees and have a right to asylum? And that's a nice idea. It certainly is attractive. These people are suffering. But if you were to actually follow that, you would completely kill the law of asylum and refugees, because we already are having a hard time actually gaining acceptance of people who are facing persecution and war, the kind of classic elements. And if you open the door to everybody who's an economic migrant or a climate refugee, you'd have nothing left. And so that, just for me, illustrates that we've got to be careful about turning everything into a right, or we end up undermining even the rights that we currently have.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My name is Emma. I'm a law student here at Columbia University. And as lawyers, we have the tendency to want to think about how do we enforce the law. And usually it is understood that without powerful players backing the law is this thing in the ether, and it is just a name to be used or something glamorous. Now, with the US and the way it's changing, and it's the way the US has an influence on international law and international policy, do you believe that it is time for different international players to start backing the international humanitarian law or human rights law? Or do you still believe that we need powerful international players to be backing these institutions, such as, for example, the International Criminal Court now having sanctions imposed by the world's superpower? A lot of people view that as not only just an attack on the court, but kind of an impediment to the court being able to function properly, because you're taking a superpower away. Not only is it not supporting this institution anymore, it's against it. And with these institutions reliant to some degree on these superpowers, how do you think we can move forward? Do you believe that we still need the players to back these institutions?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the International Criminal Court, I think we have to recognize that it hardly ever had US support. You know, it didn't have Russian support, didn't have Chinese support, it didn't have Indian support. And indeed, if you go back to the Rome Conference of, I guess, 1998, the US voted against the treaty. It lost 120-7. You know, and what its main objection, it was trying to prevent an American from ever being prosecuted, and it objected to the idea that the court would have jurisdiction over crimes committed on the territory of a member if it was committed by a national of a non-member. You know, and so, you know, if I, as an American, I could go any place and commit a crime, and I could never be prosecuted because the US hadn't joined the court. Now, despite that opposition, the court took off. You know, the US was completely isolated. And interestingly, I mean, when Putin was finally charged, the US abandoned that position. Now, it's come back to it under Trump, you know. But what Trump has done, imposing sanctions, we have to recognize it's utterly outrageous. You know, this is such blatant interference with an independent institution of justice. I think Trump is opening himself up for obstruction of justice charges, you know, which the prior prosecutor didn't do when Trump imposed sanctions on her. She turned the other cheek. But Karim Khan's a different character, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if he charges Trump, just to underscore that what he's doing is outrageous. Now, this doesn't mean Trump gets arrested tomorrow, but it means that 125 governments would have a duty to arrest him if he showed up, so they would tell him not to show up. You know, just the way Putin couldn't go to the BRICS summit in South Africa without fear of arrest. So, you know, and I go through the story in quite a bit of detail, and Richard Dicker is here someplace, who you're over here, who led this effort for Human Rights Watch.
A professor last semester as well.
Okay, but
this is
but
your
you know
forte.
what Richard did in basically rallying 60 plus governments of small and medium-sized democracies to use their combined moral clout to stand up to the superpowers was super successful, and was very similar to what Joe Becker, who's here someplace, back here, did for child soldiers, you know, and it's similar to what we did for landmines and for cluster munitions. You know, these were all efforts that, at least at the beginning, if not throughout, the U.S. opposed. And nonetheless, you know, we were able to kind of build enough of a moral consensus among everybody else to push it through. So I do not view Trump's opposition to the ICC as its demise. We've mostly lived with U.S. opposition and have learned to circumvent and survive it.
Thank you. Can I ask a somewhat related question to that? You know, in many ways, what we call the rules-based international order was really dependent on U.S. power, U.S.'s economic as well as its role as global policeman. Now that the U.S. is withdrawing from the global stage, do you think in the end that may be a good thing?
Well, I mean, I after watching how the U.S. voted in the General Assembly last week on the Ukraine resolution, I'm glad that they're not on the UN Human Rights Council. It would just be a negative vote, you know. But I mean, that's kind of a facile answer. Overall, no. I think, you know, overall, because the U.S. is so powerful, to have it on our side is still important.
On the other hand,
it's just not on our side right now.
On the other hand, many countries see all of this human rights advocacy as a projection of American power. You know, it's a Western imposition. So for, you know, this to have less of an American voice, do you think that would be helpful?
Well, sometimes that is.
Yeah?
I mean, one point I make in the book is that the last time Trump withdrew from the Human Rights Council, it didn't fall apart, you know. And one big success we had there was with Venezuela, where if the U.S. had been there, the effort to, you know, condemn Maduro's repression would have been seen as an imperialist venture.
Right.
And without the U.S. there, a group of Latin American democracies plus Canada combined as the so-called Lima Group pushed this through, won, and it was seen as a much more principled effort. So that, you know, that does happen. There can be advantages, but, you know, even recognizing that, I think we're better off having the U.S. on our side than on the other side.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My name is Kate. I'm a student at journalism school here. I think you sort of touched upon it already, but when it comes to the tools that you have to create impact, and specifically about cases of flagrant violation of human rights, say bombings, for instance, I was wondering how much of your work is reliant on the economic pressure of some nations over others and sort of the historical Western powers, and doesn't it leave you sort of stranded, and doesn't that leave them sort of in impunity when nations like the US, for instance, with Israel, sort of has like the economic power in their hands? How much of your work relies on sort of the cooperation of powers like the US and major countries in European Union, and yeah, what are the ways around it that actually make the bombing stop?
Yeah, I mean, look, with Israel's bombing of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, the only power that really mattered was the U.S. government. You know, so I mean, European governments, you know, took varied positions. So you had, you know, Spain, Belgium, Ireland being kind of outspoken against Israel. You had, you know, Germany supporting Israel regardless of what it did. You had others sort of more in the middle. But in the end, the U.S. economic support was so huge that that's all that mattered. I mean, Netanyahu could put up with Biden protesting and Biden saying, you know, feed them a little bit better or be a little more careful when you bomb. But as long as the arms and the aid kept coming, he ignored Biden. And, you know, the only thing Biden did was to suspend delivery of the 2,000-pound bombs, which were, you know, utterly inappropriate. These bombs that kill people within, you know, kind of a 2 football field radius. These are wholly indiscriminate weapons when used in a heavily populated area like Gaza. And, you know, but other than that, everything went, and now Trump has resumed those. So Israel was going to ignore everybody else so long as it had U.S. backing. And the only silver lining in this is that Netanyahu at this point is really dependent on Trump. You know, and we saw with this current temporary ceasefire that is now kind of over with, Trump, you know, twisted Netanyahu's arm and made him sign up. You know, Netanyahu can ignore the Democrats because he knows that he still has AIPAC and the Christian evangelicals and the kind of right wing of the Republican Party, but he can't ignore Trump because he's got nobody else. And so when Trump comes in and says, sign that temporary ceasefire agreement, he signed. Now if Trump recognizes that the only way he gets his grand Mideast deal, you know, Saudi normalization of relations with Israel, is to listen to the Saudi crown prince and have a concrete path to a Palestinian state, Trump has the capacity more than anybody else to push Netanyahu to agree. You know, that's not where he is right now. But this idea of, you know, building a Gaza Riviera is absurd. That's not going anyplace. And so I think we need to, you know, make the deal maker understand that if he wants progress here, he's got to push in the Palestinian state direction. And that's got to be our strategy. You know, whether we win or not, I can't say. This is a tough battle. But that's got to be what we push for.
I wanted to pop in with a question for our students. So in your book, and specifically in the Israel chapter, you detail all of the ways in which pro-Israel advocates attacked the work of Human Rights Watch. And you detail not only that, but also their effects on journalists and attempts to make these stories not worth doing by creating more trouble than it feels worth. What advice do you have for journalists who are facing some of that kind of very aggressive, adversarial, organized attacks on their reporting, fair reporting on human rights? What advice would you have to young journalists who are right now creating a name for themselves and trying to do this work? That's the first part. And the second is, we can see so many examples in which young people today on campuses and elsewhere are first, their exposure, the wars in which they're growing up and seeing here in the United States are being funded and enabled, as you just described, with US backing. And they've seen the failures of certain institutions to quell or address that, whether that's the ICC and these arrest warrants and these claims by different Western governments about not arresting Netanyahu and Gallant. And they see, I think, like a broken system, because that is their introduction to all of this. What would you tell them about the future of human rights and the system that they're seeing today?
Okay, well, there's a lot there, isn't it? First, in terms of how to report on Israel, I would not shy away. I would be careful, and this may be predictable that I'm going to say this, but I think as long as you really stick to human rights and humanitarian law principles, you're safe. So if you end up becoming a Hamas sympathizer and downplaying what happened on October 7th, and and really kind of violating human rights because you think the other side is just, you're going to get into trouble, and that's not a route I would take. I think human rights principles fairly applied to both sides. You end up criticizing Israel much more because Israel has just been such a bigger violator. But I have found, and I've given a lot of talks and have written a lot about this, that as long as you sort of stick within human rights and humanitarian law principles and stay factual, you survive, even if you're very critical. And so, that's kind of the broad advice I would give. I know everybody's afraid of the charge of anti-Semitism, and I think it's important that we push back when the concept is inappropriately used to silence legitimate criticism of Israel. Because anti-Semitism is a real problem around the world. And when people think that charges of anti-Semitism are just an excuse to stop criticism of Israel, it cheapens this concept that Jews around the world need. And so I think we need to say that and push back when we know that it's legitimate criticism, but people are just trying to censor us with this charge. And it, in many ways it comes back to, what is the appropriate lesson to draw from the Holocaust? And, Germany represents the wrong lesson right now. They have this, Staatsräson, where they basically have decided they're going to support Israel regardless of what it does. It doesn't matter how abusive it is, how repressive, they feel that their debt to the Jews is to support Israel. And I think that is utterly misguided. That if you really want to prevent another Holocaust against anybody, you've got to strengthen human rights standards. And if you create a Palestinian exception to human rights standards today, there'll be an exception for Jews tomorrow and for somebody else the next day, and you won't have human rights standards. The only way to have stronger human rights standards is to uphold them for everybody. And if Israel violates them, criticize Israel for doing that. I think that's the right lesson to draw from the Holocaust. And if people, from this wrong perspective, start figuring it's okay to misuse the concept of anti-Semitism to just silence criticism of Israel, I think they're doing a disservice to Jews, and they're doing a disservice to the cause of human rights around the world.
On the second question, what seems to be a broken system?
The broken system. Okay. Look, there are, the Security Council is completely stymied by the vetoes. I'm not even going to go there. It's not working today. The General Assembly of the UN Human Rights Council, there is no veto. And we've been able to get things done there. We got a special prosecutor for Syria set up in the General Assembly. I described that whole process in the book. It's been very strong on Ukraine. It's condemned Russia numerous times. It's expelled Russia from the Human Rights Council. In the Human Rights Council itself, it has investigated, reported, scrutinized on a whole range of very important issues. Syria, Myanmar, Iran, Ethiopia, just again now Congo. I mean, I can go on and on. And this is not just sort of meaningless report writing. I mean, to be condemned by the UN leading human rights body is something that every government hates. And when Xi Jinping thought that China was going to just be put on the agenda for what it was doing with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, he personally started calling heads of state to try to corral them to vote with him. This is not just some irrelevant thing in the back office of the foreign ministry. He cared desperately. So that shows the potential of these institutions. We don't always win, but in the Human Rights Council, we win a lot. And there's certain areas we just haven't been able to go yet, but it is an important institution and it's very worth working with. The International Criminal Court, has been a disappointment in many ways in that it has not convicted government officials. So far, it has convicted only warlords, but it has been charging government officials, which is a very important statement. Nobody wants that. And there will come a time when the Putins or Netanyahus of the world are surrendered, just like Milosevic, was surrendered when he never thought he would be. A different tribunal, but the same idea. He thought he was home free. He was a president. And politics change. People lose power. It's very hard to be president for life, and it's hard to guarantee impunity forever. So I think we have to work with these institutions and make the most of them.
So it's just the system is just limping along. It's not broken.
Yes. I mean, it's not broken. And we can improve it. It's very worth fighting within these systems.
Yes, please. You have the last question.
Okay, the last question. This is Cindy Yanhua Liu. I'm an alumni leader. Thank you so much to organize this event. And also, I, like the way you have optimism, and I would agree. And also, I like your opinion saying, I mean, my naive understanding about the Human Rights Watch. So it's an independent institution, right? So you don't get the funding from the government, then you wouldn't align with yourself with any, either Democrat or Republican. So I heard you talk about you kind of agree with President Trump's idea to cease the ceasefire with the Ukraine and Russian war, and also you have the past experience to work with President Putin. So I have this kind of naive idea, maybe the Human Rights Watch can work along with all this government, even with President Trump, right, to maybe help to negotiate this deal in a more effective way, and then not losing U.S. government face, like, kind of this big, some kind of White House, argument. So maybe, I mean, that's just my naive idea. I mean, your institution work with all this?
Is her naive idea also your naive idea?
No, I mean, look, the Trump people are not welcoming Human Rights Watch into the White House. But, in a situation like that, when you don't have physical access, you communicate through the media. And Human Rights Watch is very good at getting media attention and getting our ideas out there. And so, this idea of sort of this is a particular resolution of Ukraine, or this is a particular resolution of Gaza, we can get that into the public domain. And the people around Trump, I mean, he doesn't read, but the people around Trump will get it to him. So there's always a way to communicate with these governments, even if you don't have physical access. And that's same is true of Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin or what have you.
Right, exactly. Or maybe even help to put pressure on President Putin, right? Because we don't even know what is Trump's, leading us to. It's kind of, sometimes it's kind of really worrisome. If you have this past experience, maybe it can help. That will bring a lot of hope to all of us.
Yeah. Let me just say one thing, because we're about to close. I'm happy to sign people's books. So if people want to purchase books, I'm happy to stay after and sign them. So, but Sheila, do you want to?
Yes, I was just going to say thank you so much, Ken, for your optimism. I know many people in this room appreciate your optimistic view of human rights and where the world is going. And thank you for writing the book. It's much needed at this time.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight.